So what we're seeing in LA and what we see in Gaza are connected. These two things are connected by the fact that Israel is the ones that train US officers, US federal agents, US military to be violent, to be able to crack down on people. So we're seeing police brutality or federal agent brutality or marine, whatever, we're going to call them the police in the United States because they're all kind of just this one blob. Basically, I'm going to be referring to them as the police in this video. So we're seeing police violence against protesters, against journalists in LA, and it is very deliberate and it is there to scare people. It is there to agitate people. It is to make them want to fight the police so then they can justify using even more force. So looking at this Reuters article, we're looking at a few articles and I'm going to look at ones in relation to Palestine as well. But from what we see here, so over 30 incidents of police violence against journalists, and this is just journalists, not including, civilians. Australian reporter hit by less than lethal munition. So I don't know if you realize this or remember this. If I can find some images, I'll put up here. But there was an Australian journalist who got shot in the leg by a rubber bullet. And when they call them less than lethal, it's because, they're not designed to kill, but they can kill you. And also the way they use them is like wholly wrong. You're supposed to use it in a way where you're trying to reduce the velocity of it, aim at the ground and get it to bounce up to hit someone, or you're from a really far distance where by the time it hits someone, the velocity is really velocity or what the speed is very low. Nah, they just shoot people like point blank with these guns, and it's crazy. And it's a journalist, someone with a microphone and a camera they're shooting. There was I think a Good Morning Britain journalist who got shot in the arm, and I'm surprised Good Morning Britain cared. They probably blamed him for it, said, it's his own fault. Probably, I don't know, whatever. That's a side thing. But the press club includes physical violence as well as other efforts to impair journalist coverage, such as non-consensual bag searches. In the category, it updates its database with reports from journalists and incidents reported on social media. So also, they're being searched by the police to try and prevent them from reporting on this. And this is all tactics that Israel uses in Palestine. So if we see in Gaza, they don't allow journalists in because they don't want to show people the actuality of what's happening so they can control the narrative. This is why Trump is coming out and saying stuff like, they spit, we hit, or he's trying to say the violent insurrectionist protesters, gangs. It's like, no, the only people being violent really are the police and ICE and whatever. And, things like throwing rocks at a car or burning a Waymo car, which is that really violence compared to the actual violence inflicted by ICE raids, inflicted by the police, the brutality of these groups against actual civilians? That's the real violence, and people reacting to that isn't really violence. Now, we'll move on to another article. So this is CNN's live update. As you can see, people are coming out to protest more so because the Marines have been deployed in LA. There's this no kings thing. People are trying to protest all around against Trump's authority, him using the military. He's got a military parade, I believe, this weekend, which is really funny because the US are always like, look at Russia doing military parades, it's disgusting. And it's like Trump wants to do one. It's kind of funny. At least 3 detained in Tucson, Arizona during anti-ICE raid. So, the protests are growing across the nation. And it's all growing, and the way it's being, and CNN are probably also guilty of this. All of them are guilty of this, where they're basically trying. Well, they're not. Probably they are guilty of this. All news media are guilty of this, even here in the UK. They're basically trying to frame it as the people are being just as violent as the police when they're not. At least here they're calling it an anti-ICE protest. 700 mobilized Marines have been deployed in LA. 7 arrests in Seattle following Wednesday's protests. So, I mean, it's getting better. They're not calling them riots anymore because they're not riots. Here's a map of all the protests popping up, predominantly left-wing, not left-wing, well, not left-wing, I wouldn't call anywhere really in the US left-wing, but like liberal areas, even in like Texas. These are the big liberal areas of Texas. Emergency curfew. So like they're starting to change the way they're reporting them. They're not calling it riots anymore. They're calling them protests. But like this is the actual violence. The police jumping on someone and trying to arrest them. This is what like it's mostly people standing here with placards, and you have this liberal media. You have like Bernie Sanders coming out and being like, "Hey, guys, violence is bad. MLK didn't like violence." I'm like, shut up, white boy. What are you talking about? And they're trying to frame this as the violence of the protests is bad, trying to defend the policing in this, even though it's like, they're going too far, but you shouldn't be violent. You got fentanyl, or as I like to call them, fentanyl. That was a bad joke. Or, Mr. I huff drugs and take money from Israel. It's like, you should be non-violent. This guy like cheers on the mass killing of Palestinians. But this is awesome. Protest hold up American flag in front of them. They should put that in the fire. That would be sick. But where was I? I got distracted. Like, it's very clear that the narrative that's trying to be molded by the US government and most of the news media, and even CNN, this probably is contributing to this, is the protests are violent, and the protesters are violent. Not all of them, but some of them here, they're saying the protests were peaceful and there were no reports of violence, KSAT reports. I'm here because I want to speak my own voice. People are too scared to come out and speak the truth of their own. One protester. So, like, overall, like, they're, like, trying to frame it as, well, as long as it doesn't get violent, it's okay. And the Trump administration is like, look how violent they are. We need to continue escalating. And when they escalate, rightfully so, the people will escalate too. And I'm sure there will be violence. There is violence, and there's nothing wrong with violence when it comes to protests, in my opinion. I think it should, if it needs to be used, it needs to be used. But the Trump administration and America as a whole will use this as a means to brutalize the people to keep them in line. And they're already doing this anyway. So it's not they will need to. They're already brutalizing people. And the fact that they're brutalizing people is something that they have learnt and actually been taught by Israel. And I've had people say this to me before as, well, what does this have to do with Israel? The US has always done this. Yes, but in the last 50-ish years, the US has become even more skilled at being violent against protesters, against the people, because of Israel. So let me just go onto the article, actually. This is from 2016 from Amnesty. So I really love this. With Chronicle Human Rights Violator Israel. That goes hard. Amnesty, sometimes you guys go hard, I'm not going to lie. So this is from 2016. So it's even at least 10 years ago this was happening. When the US Department of Justice published a report, August 10th, 2016, that documented widespread constitutional violations, discriminatory enforcement, and culture of retaliation within the Baltimore Police Department. There was rightly a general reaction of outrage, but what hasn't received as much attention is where Baltimore police received training on crowd control, use of force, and surveillance. Israel's national police, military, and intelligence agencies. So all of these different places have traveled to Israel for training. Thousands of others have received training from Israeli officials here in the US. Many of these trips are taxpayer funded, whilst others are private funded. Since 2002, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee Project Interchange, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs have paid for police chiefs, assistant chiefs, and captains to train in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. All of this stuff, all the brutality you are seeing from US police officers right now, from US ICE, like I said, I'm calling them all police, trained by Israel, because Israel is a place that is like where they manufacture and test out violence against people. There's a great book, I think it's called the Palestine Laboratory or some. I'll put it on the screen. It's basically talking about how Israel is basically constantly trying to start fights, constantly starting wars with their neighbors and with the Palestinians to try to be able to like test out weaponry and tactics, which they then train and sell to other nations for a profit. It's all a Ponzi scheme. Like the US gives Israel money, Israel uses that money to perfect warfare tactics and weaponry, and then they sell it back to the US, or they give it to the US so they can use it on other brown people. But yeah, like for years, Amnesty International has found Israeli military security and police forces responsible for the same behavior, which is escalate encounters and stifle public cooperation. Furthermore, the reports detail how an overall lack of training leads to excessive force being used against those with mental health issues, juveniles, and people who present little or no threat against others. So, like, here, they don't get training to, like, actually de-escalate things, so then that leans into the violence that Israel treats and teaches these police and soldiers, whatever. This is from 2023, and it even shows you, like, how police agencies work with the IDF, even on things that aren't just training. So, US police agencies took intelligence directly from IDF. Analysis of Blue Leaks Trove shows police received training on domestic Muslim extremists from pro-Israel groups. Hacked police files show US law enforcement agencies for decades received analysis of incidents in the Israel-Palestine conflict directly from Israeli defense forces and Israeli think tanks trained on domestic Muslim extremists from pro-Israel non-profits and surveillance social media accounts of pro-Palestine activists in the US. So Israel is literally like a hand-in-hand with police forces in the United States. There are people who are like, there's no relationship, you're pulling at straws. Quite literally, we have from a year and a half ago literal leaked documents showing how close the United States is. The United States, like police forces, are to the Israeli military. And this is from earlier this year. So deadly exchange. US sends hundreds of law enforcement to Israel to learn worst practices from IDF. Thousands of law enforcement officials have traveled to Israel to learn new repressive strategies and surveillance techniques from the Israeli National Police, Israeli Defense Forces, and Shin Bet, who are basically a terrorist group, who inflict violence, crowd control, and surveillance onto Palestinians. Anti-imperialist advocates say the tactics being taught to US law enforcement were battle-tested on Palestinians, like I mentioned in that book, which I will have put the screen earlier, and spread to the US to target black and brown communities through a training relationship that grants Israeli forces more power and profit, causing further harm to Palestinians. So Israel will perfect and brutalize Palestinians, and then because they've continuously brutalized Palestinians, perfected that brutalization, they can then teach that to US police and US military to continue their brutalization of black and brown communities, predominantly in the United States. So like I said at the beginning, the thesis of this video, Israel and the LA, brutalization of people are linked. Everything that the police and the federal agents in the United States are doing, the kettling, the using less than lethal arms, they use the LRADs, they use them, all of that stuff taught to them, and specifically the brutalization taught to them by Israel. And guess who funds Israel? The United States funds Israel. So really, the US is funding Israel to use Palestinians as a testing ground for them to then be able to use it on the people in the US. And this isn't just the Trump administration that does this. This has been going on for decades now, as you saw in 2016. It was happening, I believe. Was Obama president in 2016? Trump was president in 2016, but it was happening before that, obviously. It was happening under Obama. It was happening under Biden. It was happening under Trump. So, quite literally, the United States as a whole funds the brutalization of Palestinians, which is then used to train US police forces to brutalize Americans. It is linked, So when I say, you need to be intersectional in your activism, you need to understand how things are connected in your activism. This is what I mean, because it's not just police forces are violent. The police forces are violent because they are trained to be violent by a violent colonial regime. I mean, police forces will always be violent. The police are always there to uphold the oppressor, but they are particularly violent. They are so adept at being violent because of their training by a colonial regime.